I'm Susan Persky, and we're in the Immersive Virtual Environment testing area. So we do several kinds of research, but everything falls under the umbrella of trying to understand the intersection between genetics and genomics with society. So that can be things like how genetic information is talked about in the clinic. It can be things like how family members talk about genetics with one another, how genetics is talked about on social media, how people think about, report about genetics and genomics in media. So all those sorts of things. As a kid, I was interested in science kind of from the get-go. Science, was my favorite class. I did science fairs in 7th and 8th grade. And so I took my first psychology class, and it was sort of like all the stars aligned, it took scientific method and it married it with this interest in what people were thinking about and what was motivating their behavior, and kind of brought it all together for me. And I went to a recruitment admissions weekend at one of the schools I'd applied to, not really thinking this was a place I would necessarily go. And I was on a tour, and I saw that there was a virtual reality lab, that there was a professor there who was studying virtual reality and how you would use that as a tool to understand human behavior and also understand what kind of effects using virtual reality would have on people. I just thought that was the coolest thing. I had never even thought about that, as a possibility. And that was pretty much it. I decided this is where I'm going to school, this is where I want to be. I've done a number of studies now doing these kind of rough approximation simulations of clinical encounters. So if I'm interested in how a patient's going to respond when you talk about genetics in some sort of health condition, then I roughly simulate a doctor. So I have a virtual doctor who might talk about genetics, and he might talk about it in different ways so we can see what way is best. Yeah, I think it looks pretty empathetic, you think? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. His eyes should follow us.
Yeah.
I was a little worried. I think they're looking a lot better. We also look at things like the people's behavior. Where are they looking? If a doctor is giving me this sort of information that I might be responding favorably to, or I might be responding unfavorably to, we can kind of tell that by people's nonverbal behavior. That can tell us a lot about what they're thinking. How positively, how negatively they're feeling. I'm planning studies, so sort of what's the next step in what we're doing. I run a virtual reality lab on behalf of my entire branch at the Genome Institute. I'm working with my colleagues to think about, what are their research questions? What do they want to study? What kinds of creative ways might we be able to use virtual reality, use other new envelope-pushing methodology tools to answer their questions? So we bring our volunteers here, and we put the head-mounted display on them, and they go into a virtual reality simulation.
Ah, okay, now I see it.
Okay, yep.
Okay.
All right.
I see the food.
So I'm going to give you this wand that we have made out of electrical tape and a PowerPoint presentation pointer. So I work with a company out in California, and we kind of go back and forth, and we design the world that people are going to see when they're here in our experiments. Mm-hmm. We design their virtual worlds. So do they look at everything and then go make food choices, or do they just kind of go up and down the buffet and say, I want this, I don't want that?
So then when I see something I want,
You just put your pointer. If you look down, you'll see your tray.
Oh, okay.
There's your tray. You should be able to walk up to the counter and take a closer look.
Grapes, steamed carrots.
Oh, yeah.
Tater tots. What's this on the end here?
Oh, brownies.
Ooh, brownies. I'm going to be bad and get a brownie.
Okay, well, let's see if you're actually able to do that. So the foods are meant to be all very child-friendly. Things like, chicken nuggets and tater tots and things like that. And so we can measure the kinds of choices that the parents make for the kids, and also the process. I love getting the data. I love, running analyses on it and finding out, what did our experiment find? What are our results, and were they what we thought they were going to be? And if they're not, what does that tell us about what we should look into next? We pick the color of the floor. We pick, how the doctor's head is going to move when he's talking. Everything is up to us, and that's really the beautiful thing about using virtual reality for research. So it's showing you basically a diagram of our room, and all the cameras that are around the periphery of the room looking for the infrared signal that the head-mounted display is giving off. So this is how it knows where in the room you're located as you're walking around making choices in the virtual buffet. It is a cool job. I get to be creative, I get to design things, and then I go and I put the head-mounted display on and I'm in a virtual world. And it was me writing down, at this time the virtual doctor should say this and he should look this way, or here are the foods that I want displayed on this virtual buffet. And then you put on the helmet and it's there. I think you really have to experience it to know how much fun it is. I really think virtual reality is up and coming, and I think the hardware is there, but the need for the content, what are people going to do with it? How are you going to apply it? How can scientists use virtual reality? I think that's the big question, and I think the ability to be part of that world, I think is incredibly cool.